The thing about Buckingham Palace is that it never really sleeps. Even at 6 in the morning, when London is still wrapped in that gray, damp quiet that belongs only to early spring, there are people. Tourists with roller bags fresh off overnight flights. Dog walkers who have done this same loop for 20 years. Pigeons that have clearly decided the Victoria Memorial belongs to them and no one else. And then there are the guards. I've walked past that palace more times than I can count. I worked a stone's throw away on Birdcage Walk for nearly 4 years, and I'll be honest, after the first few weeks you stop really seeing them. The red tunics, the bearskin caps, the absolute, almost inhuman stillness. They become part of the landscape, like the black iron railings. Like the gold on the gates. You stop noticing them the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. But on the morning of April the 1st, 2 years ago, I noticed. Everyone noticed. Let me set the scene properly because the details matter here. They always do. It was a Tuesday. April the 1st, April Fool's Day, obviously, and London had woken up to one of those mornings that can't quite decide what it wants to be. Not raining exactly, but not dry either. That fine, invisible drizzle that soaks through your jacket before you realize what's happening. The kind of morning where the pavements gleam dark gray and the buses leave long, wet tracks behind them on the road. The tourist crowds were already building by 8:30. That surprised me at first, but then April Fool's Day falls in the school holidays some years, and this was one of those years. There were families everywhere. Kids in bright waterproof jackets. Parents holding paper cups of coffee like lifelines. Older couples with proper cameras, not phones, moving slowly and deliberately, framing their shots with patience. The changing of the guard wasn't scheduled until 11, but that doesn't stop people arriving early. There's a particular kind of tourist, I mean this with genuine affection, who treats every royal landmark like it might vanish if they're not watching it constantly. They arrive at 9. They claim a spot. They wait. I was cutting through St. James's Park on my way to a meeting. Completely ordinary Tuesday morning. I had a coffee from the little kiosk near the bridge, and I was about 15 minutes early, so I slowed down near the palace gates. Just for a moment, just to look. That's when I first saw the group. There were maybe 8 of them. American, I'd guess from what I heard later, though that's not really relevant. Young, early 20s mostly. That particular age where you're confident enough to do something stupid and still young enough that you think it's funny. A couple of them had matching hoodies. One was wearing a bright orange beanie that you could probably see from the other side of the park. They were gathered near the sentry box on the left side of the gates. Not the main entrance, the pedestrian area where the public can actually approach and look at the guards up close. There's always a crowd there. It's one of the iconic photo spots in the entire world, and standing in that box, utterly motionless, was the guard. I didn't know his name then. I found out later. For now, I'll call him what everyone else ended up calling him that day, just the guard. He was young from what I could see, maybe mid-20s. The full dress uniform, the scarlet tunic, the white belt, the black trousers with the perfect crease, the bearskin cap that adds nearly a foot to your height. Standing with his rifle at his shoulder, his chin level, his gaze fixed at some middle distance that exists only in the discipline of soldiers on formal duty. He wasn't looking at the group. He was looking through them, or past them, or nowhere really. That's what those men are trained to do. The group had noticed this, the way all tourist groups eventually notice it. And they'd decided, because it was April Fool's Day, and because they were young, and because that combination of factors has been responsible for most of history's worst decisions, that they were going to do something about it. I should say here, I've seen tourists try to get a reaction from the guards before. Almost everyone who spent time near that palace has. It's a peculiar sport that people take up seemingly without planning to. You watch someone walk up close to take a photo and then almost involuntarily they try something. A funny face, a loud noise, standing very close and staring. The guards never react. That's the whole point. They're not there to react. Their job is presence, not performance. Their stillness is the statement. But April Fool's Day brings out a particular ambition in people. The whole day is a kind of cultural permission slip. A one-day agreement that pranks are acceptable, that tricks are fair game, that making someone look foolish is temporarily elevated to an art form. And I suppose when you're standing outside Buckingham Palace on April the 1st, looking at a man who is famously, legendarily, professionally incapable of reacting, the temptation must become almost overwhelming. The group had clearly been planning something. Or at least, The plan had been evolving for the last 10 minutes while they stood there, getting progressively louder and increasingly nudging each other. The one in the orange beanie, I'll call him Orange for simplicity, seemed to be the architect. He was doing that thing people do when they're about to commit to a bad idea but want to make sure someone else goes first. Animated gesturing, wide eyes, pointing at the guard and then at his friends and back at the guard. I watched from about 20 meters away, sipping my coffee, half thinking I should probably keep walking. I didn't keep walking. Here's what they did. And I want to describe this carefully because it's important to understand both the scale of what they attempted and the complete, absolute failure of the result. Orange Beanie produced, from somewhere inside his hoodie, a fake mustache. One of those novelty stick-on mustaches, thick and dark, slightly curled at the ends. The kind of thing you'd find in a joke shop or a children's party bag. He held it up to show the group. There was a burst of suppressed laughter, the kind where everyone puts their hands over their mouths and looks around guiltily. The plan, as far as I could piece it together from watching, was this. One of the group would approach the guard on the pretext of taking a photograph. While they were close enough, Orange Beanie would somehow attach the mustache to the guard's face. The fact that this was obviously, fundamentally, completely impossible did not appear to have penetrated their planning. The girl they sent first, I'll call her Purple Scarf because she was wearing one, walked up to the sentry box with her phone raised. Very casual, very innocent. She positioned herself for a selfie, edging gradually closer to the guard's peripheral vision. The guard did not move. Purple Scarf got closer, smiled at the camera, clicked the photo, edged a fraction closer, clicked another. Edged, and here's where it started to go wrong, just slightly too close. What happened next was not a reaction, not exactly. It wasn't anger or surprise or any of the emotions you might expect. It was something more precise than that. The guard moved. Not dramatically, not explosively, but with a kind of controlled, deliberate authority that cuts through a crowd the way a fire alarm does, not because it's loud, but because it means something. He took one step forward, just one. His boot came down on the wet stone with a sharp, clean crack. He brought his rifle down from his shoulder to a formal carry position in front of him. And then, in a voice that was neither shouting nor gentle, a voice that simply occupied all available space, he said, "Stand clear of the sentry." 3 words, that's all. Purple Scarf stumbled backward. Not because she was pushed, he hadn't touched her, hadn't come anywhere near her, but because the sheer unexpectedness of the sound, the movement, the authority of it, caused her body to react before her brain had finished processing what was happening. Orange Beanie dropped the mustache. The crowd, and there was a crowd now, maybe 30 or 40 people who'd been watching with varying degrees of awareness, went completely silent for a fraction of a second. That specific silence that only exists in public spaces when everyone simultaneously realizes something real is happening. And then everyone started talking at once. I moved a bit closer. Not to interfere, I wasn't about to do that, but because something about the guard's manner had shifted in a way I couldn't quite name, and I wanted to understand it. He'd returned to his original position, rifle back at the shoulder, gaze forward, chin level, as if the whole thing had simply not happened. Except, and this is the part that stayed with me, it wasn't the same stillness as before. Before, it had been the stillness of absence, of a man deliberately making himself into a statue. Now it was the stillness of a man who was very, very present, alert in a way that is different from vigilance, aware. His eyes hadn't moved, but something had. Purple Scarf had rejoined her group, who were alternating between laughing and looking genuinely unsettled. Orange Beanie had retrieved his novelty mustache from the ground, and was holding it in a way that suggested he deeply regretted its existence. And then something happened that nobody had planned for. A small boy, couldn't have been more than 5, maybe 6, broke away from his family somewhere to my left and trotted directly toward the sentry box. His mother was 3 steps behind him, reaching for him, calling his name in that particular parental tone that means I am alarmed but trying not to alarm you. The boy stopped right in front of the guard. He craned his neck back to look up at the bearskin cap. His expression was one of pure, undiluted wonder, the kind of look that only children and very wise adults can manage. "Are you real?" the boy asked. Everyone within earshot heard it. Several people laughed softly. A few pulled out their phones. The guard said nothing, did not move. His gaze remained forward. The boy considered this for a moment. Then he reached out and very gently tapped the guard's boot with one small finger. Once, twice, testing. The guard's expression did not change, not by a single muscle. The boy turned to his mother, who had now reached him and was crouching beside him with one hand on his shoulder. His eyes were enormous. "Mom," he whispered, in a whisper that carried clearly to everyone nearby. "He's the most real thing I've ever seen." I don't know why that landed the way it did. Maybe it was the contrast, this child's complete sincerity right after the group's silly scheme. Maybe it was just the morning, the drizzle, the accumulated weight of watching something ridiculous give way to something genuine. But the mood around those gates changed. People stopped filming. Or rather, they stopped filming the way you film a spectacle and started watching the way you watch something that matters. The American group had gone quiet. Orange Beanie had put the mustache in his pocket. They were watching the boy and his mother walk away, and they were watching the guard, and something in their faces had shifted. I've thought about that moment a lot in the years since, about what it means to try to make something funny out of something serious and then be quietly shown the difference. Not by a lecture, not by a reprimand, just by a child who asked one honest question. But the morning wasn't over yet. Not even close. By 10 o'clock, the crowd had thickened considerably. The tourist coaches were arriving on the mall, depositing groups at the edges of the park. The police presence had increased slightly, standard for a busy morning, and there was that particular energy that builds around the palace before the changing of the guard. An anticipatory hum, people finding their spots, children being lifted onto shoulders. The American group had lingered. I'd expected them to move on, frankly, but they were still there, and their dynamic had changed. They were quieter, watching the guard more carefully with what looked less like mischief and more like actual curiosity. Orange Beanie, whose name I eventually found out was Tyler, but let's keep calling him Orange Beanie because the story is better that way, had been studying the guard for the better part of 20 minutes. He'd stopped laughing. He kept folding and unfolding his arms. At some point, he turned to the friend next to him and said, quietly enough that I wouldn't have caught it if I hadn't been paying attention, "How does he do that?" Not as a joke, he genuinely wanted to know. His friend shrugged, "Training, I guess." "No, but how does he do that? Just like stand there with everyone watching and not care." His friend didn't answer. Nobody around them answered. But a woman standing nearby, 60s, sensible walking shoes, local accent, half turned and said, without looking at them directly, "He cares, that's why he can do it." And then she went back to watching the gate. Orange Beanie stared at the back of her head for a moment. Then he looked at the guard again. And I watched him get it. Not all of it, I don't think any of us ever get all of it. But enough. The beginning of understanding something that can't really be explained, only witnessed. The guard stood there in the drizzle, in his scarlet tunic, with his rifle and his bearskin and his absolute, unshakable presence. And he didn't know any of this was happening behind him. Didn't know about the mustache, or the child, or the woman's comment, or the young man in the orange beanie standing 20 feet away having a quiet, private reckoning with something he didn't have words for yet. He just stood his post. Like he always did. Like he would until the relief came. That was part one. But what happened at 11 o'clock, when the guards changed, when the crowd surged forward, and when one particular member of that American group did something completely unexpected? That's where the day took its real turn. Stay with me. The changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace is not a quiet event. People who have never seen it tend to imagine something solemn and small, a private handover, a brief ceremony. What actually happens is closer to theater. Organized, precise, centuries-old theater, but theater nonetheless. The new guard marches from Wellington Barracks with a band. The old sentries are formally relieved. Commands are given and received in voices that carry across the forecourt. There's music. There's marching. There's the sound of boots on stone that you feel in your chest as much as you hear with your ears. The crowds pressed forward along the railings. I'd given up any pretense of heading to my meeting. I'd texted ahead, made an excuse, and quietly accepted that I was spending my morning at Buckingham Palace, which felt both absurd and completely right. The American group had claimed spots near the front. Orange Beanie had actually helped a small, elderly woman find a gap in the crowd where she could see. I watched him tap a man on the shoulder and gesture for him to move slightly, creating a clear sightline. The man obliged without complaint. These small human adjustments happen constantly in crowds, and nobody ever remarks on them. The band arrived first. The sound preceded them, the drums and the brass coming down the mall, cutting through the traffic noise and the low murmur of the crowd. People began recording. Children pointed. And the guard who had stood all morning in the rain, who had spoken those 3 words, who had stood motionless while a small boy tapped his boot, who had not reacted to the mustache or the giggling or any of it. He was about to be formally relieved of his duty. The ceremony moved through its paces with the kind of precision that makes you realize how much of human endeavor is really just the disciplined repetition of a single thing done correctly, over and over, across generations. Commands rang out. The new sentries marched to their positions. The handover happened with an economy of movement that was almost beautiful. No wasted gestures, no theatrics, just the clean transfer of responsibility from one pair of hands to another. And then the outgoing guard, my guard, the one who'd stood all morning, marched off with his detachment toward the barracks. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look anywhere but forward. But here's the thing I wasn't expecting. Orange Beanie started clapping. Alone at first. A single person clapping for a soldier marching away who couldn't hear him and wouldn't have responded if he could. It looked slightly mad. It looked, for about 3 seconds, like exactly the kind of thing you might start doing on April Fool's Day as another prank. But it wasn't. I could see that from his face. He was clapping the way people clap when they've witnessed something and don't have another way to express it. Not performance, just response. And then, one by one, the people around him joined in. It spread down the railing like a wave. Tourists who'd never seen each other before, who'd spent the morning jostling for position and bumping elbows, suddenly clapping together for a man who was already gone around the corner. The sound lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then it stopped, and the crowd settled back into itself, and the new sentries stood at their posts, and London continued being London, vast and indifferent and magnificent, and nobody said anything about what had just happened. They didn't need to. I found out the guard's name later that week. His regiment confirmed the incident after it was mentioned briefly in a local paper, and a video, short, slightly shaky, filmed on someone's phone had circulated online, showing the moment he stepped forward and gave that command. The comment section was not what you'd expect. People weren't laughing. They were asking questions, real ones, about training, about discipline, about what it means to hold a post, about what it means to show up to something completely and not waver. His name was Corporal James Whitfield, 26 years old, had been with the regiment for 3 years. According to the brief regimental statement, he was described simply as a soldier who had carried out his duties in accordance with his training and the standards of his regiment. Which is technically accurate and also tells you almost nothing. What it doesn't tell you is this. The morning before that April Fool's Day, Whitfield had attended a small ceremony at his barracks where the regiment had marked the passing of a retired veteran who had served in the same sentry role 40 years earlier. An old man who had stood at this same gate, in this same uniform, in a different era. The connection between that service and this one, between that generation and this, was what Whitfield carried with him onto the forecourt that morning, along with his rifle and his training and his absolute refusal to flinch. He didn't know about the mustache until afterward. When someone told him, he laughed. Genuinely, freely laughed. A mustache, he said, apparently. They really brought a mustache. And then he went quiet for a moment, the way you do when something has reminded you of something else, and he said, I hope they got a good photo. I've told this story a few times since it happened. At dinner tables, on a long train journey once, to a colleague who was having a bad week and needed something to think about other than her bad week. The reaction is always roughly the same. People laugh at the mustache part, they soften at the child, and then they go quiet for a moment at the end. I think it's because the story is really about something that's hard to describe without sounding slightly ridiculous. It's about the difference between spectacle and substance. About what it looks like when someone takes their role so seriously that everything silly simply slides off them. About how discipline, real discipline, the kind that comes from something deeper than just following rules, looks an awful lot like peace from the outside. April Fool's Day is built on the premise that nothing is too serious to be made fun of, that every authority can be undermined if you're clever enough, that the right prank at the right moment can reveal the pretense behind any performance. But Corporal James Whitfield wasn't performing. That's what Orange Beanie figured out, standing in the drizzle with a novelty mustache going soft in his pocket. That's what the little boy knew before any of them. Children usually do. The guard wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. He wasn't playing at duty or wearing seriousness like a costume. He simply was what he was, fully, completely, without reservation. And you can't prank that. You really can't. End of Part 1, 3,847 words. Part 2, the afternoon shift. The morning crowds thinned after the changing of the guard the way they always do, gradually at first, then all at once, as though the ceremony were the reason everyone had come, and now that it was over, London had better things to offer. It usually does. But some people stayed. The families stayed longest, particularly the ones with younger children who hadn't quite grasped the concept of a schedule and who saw no reason to leave a place that still had interesting things to look at. The pigeons, the gold on the gates, the new sentries at their posts, fresh faces, straight backs, the same scarlet against the same gray sky. I'd bought another coffee by then. I had completely abandoned any pretense of productivity for the day. Some mornings are like that. They just gently insist that you stay and watch. The American group had dispersed after the ceremony. Orange Beanie, Tyler, I reminded myself, had gone with them, and I'd watched them disappear down toward St. James's Park, talking in that slightly subdued way of a group whose energy has shifted from mischief to something more thoughtful. Whether it would last, whether the thing they'd encountered that morning would stick, or whether it would become just another travel story, told out of sequence at a party, I had no way of knowing. But the day had more to offer. By early afternoon, the clouds had made up their mind. The drizzle had committed to becoming actual rain, light but consistent, the kind that turns the palace forecourt dark and makes the tourists who have forgotten their umbrellas, which is most of them, huddle under whatever overhangs they can find. A new sentry had been at his box for about an hour. He was taller than Whitfield, with the particular build of someone who'd been very athletic in school and had never quite stopped. His presence was different, less stillness, more solidity, if that distinction makes sense. Like the difference between ice and stone, both immovable, different reasons. His name, I found out later, was Private Daniel Osai, 23 years old. This was only his fourth solo duty rotation at this post, which means he was, relative to the history of this particular position, very new. Not inexperienced, his training was the same as everyone else's, rigorous and thorough and longer than most people realize, but new to standing in this specific box, at this specific gate, with this specific weight of expectation resting on him. He wouldn't have shown it. That's not a criticism, that's the training, you don't show it. The incident that afternoon began, like most memorable incidents, with something completely ordinary. A school group arrived. British, that particular flavor of organized chaos that belongs to a class of 12-year-olds on a field trip, all wearing matching high-visibility yellow vests over their school uniforms and moving in a loose formation around two harried teachers who kept counting heads. 32 kids, from what I could see. The kind of age where they're too old to be simply odd and too young to be genuinely cool about it. The complicated zone where everything is simultaneously fascinating and embarrassing. Their teacher, a man in his late 40s, wire-framed glasses, a waterproof jacket that had clearly been through many field trips, positioned them along the railings and began explaining the history of the guard in that practiced, slightly theatrical way of teachers who have given the same talk many times and still manage to care about it. Most of the kids were listening. Some were whispering. Two were, inevitably, attempting to take photos of each other pretending to be the guard, the classic frozen pose, chin up, face blank, while their friends dissolved into poorly contained laughter. And then one of the girls, small, with her hair in two braids under the high-visibility vest, raised her hand. "Sir, is it true that it's April Fool's Day?" The teacher paused. "It is, yes." "And is it true that you can't trick the guards, like no matter what you do?" "That's generally true. They're trained to maintain their position regardless of what happens around them." The girl considered this with the particular intensity of a 12-year-old who has just been handed a challenge. What counts as regardless of what? The teacher, to his credit, recognized the direction this was heading and pivoted smoothly. What I can tell you is that attempting to distract or bother the guard is actually against the rules. You can go close and take a photo, but you can't interfere with the guard's duties. What if something funny happened that wasn't on purpose? Laughter from her classmates. Even the teacher suppressed a smile. Let's focus on the history for now, shall we? But the girl's question had planted something. Not in the children. They'd moved on to their next tangent within 30 seconds, in the way of 12-year-olds everywhere. It had planted something in the small crowd of adults nearby who had heard the exchange and were now, whether they admitted it or not, watching Private Osai with slightly more attention than they'd been giving him a few minutes ago. What if something happened that wasn't on purpose? The answer came from the rain. By 2:30, the light drizzle had become something more purposeful, and the courtyard and pavement areas around the palace were managing that particular trick of London, where they become simultaneously slippery and invisible about it. The kind of wet surface that looks like it should be fine and turns out not to be. A couple tourists, somewhere in their 50s with good cameras and sensible shoes that nonetheless proved unequal to the situation, were walking past the sentry area when the woman's foot found a patch of wet stone at exactly the wrong angle. She didn't fall hard. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was one of those stumbles that goes on slightly longer than a stumble should, where you watch someone trying to recover their balance and you're not quite sure for a moment which way it's going to go. She went down on one knee. Her husband caught her arm, but too late to stop it, just in time to make sure she didn't go any further. Her camera swung on its strap and clattered against the railing. The whole thing took about 3 seconds. Private Os was off his post before anyone else had moved. This is the part I want to describe carefully, because it's easy to overstate it, and the truth is actually more interesting than the overstatement. He didn't sprint. He didn't drop his rifle. He moved with a controlled urgency, fast enough to be purposeful, disciplined enough to remain exactly what he was. A soldier carrying out an action the way a soldier does, without wasted motion, without drama, without making it about himself. He was at the woman's side in perhaps 4 seconds. He offered his arm, a formal, proper gesture, not a grab, and said something quiet to her. She took his arm. He helped her stand. Her husband was making the sounds that people make when they're relieved, but still running on adrenaline. Too many words, slightly too fast, checking and rechecking that she was all right. The woman herself was embarrassed more than hurt, that particular mixture of pain and mortification that comes with a public stumble in your 50s. But she was looking at Private Osai, and what was on her face was not embarrassment anymore. He asked if she was hurt. She said she didn't think so, her knee a bit. He nodded and said something to her husband, and then, and this is the detail I keep coming back to, he waited. Just a moment, made sure she was steady, made sure the husband had her, made sure. And then he returned to his box. Took his position. The rifle came back to his shoulder. He was still again. The whole interaction had lasted perhaps 90 seconds. He hadn't asked anyone's permission. He hadn't made an announcement. He'd just seen something that required action and acted, and then returned to what he was supposed to be doing, as if the two things were not in conflict at all, because they weren't. Because being a soldier on duty isn't just about standing still. It's about being ready. It's about noticing. It's about understanding that the reason you're there is, at its core, about people. The woman's name was Margaret. I know because she told me, 20 minutes later, when I found her sitting on a bench near the memorial with her husband, warming her hands on a coffee they'd bought from a nearby cart. She'd seen me watching from nearby. I'd clearly been there all morning, apparently long enough to count as a landmark myself, and she called over to ask if I'd seen what happened. I said I had. She shook her head slowly. I feel terrible. His post, I disrupted his post. Her husband, James, which seemed appropriate for the day, said firmly that she hadn't disrupted anything. He left his post, she said. For me, he left his post for me. He came back to it, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Yes, she said. He did, didn't he? And she said it not like it was an obvious thing, but like it was the most important part. I think she was right. The afternoon continued. The rain intensified and then stopped completely, as London rain tends to do, as if it loses interest in its own project. The sun came out briefly, sharp, clear April sun that turned all the wet surfaces silver and made the gold on the palace gates look molten. Private Osai stood his post. He would stand it until his relief came. He would do so with the same quiet, complete authority he'd shown all afternoon, whether anyone was watching or not, whether it was April Fool's Day or any other day, whether the people around him were trying to make him laugh or simply going about their lives, or, occasionally, slipping on wet stone and needing a hand. The school group filed past on their way back to their coach. The girl with the braids paused at the railing and looked at Osai for a long moment. Then she waved. Very small, very serious. He didn't wave back, of course he didn't. But she didn't seem to expect him to. She just turned and followed her classmates, and I had the strange feeling that she'd understood something that her teacher's explanation hadn't quite reached. There's a question people ask when they hear these stories. They ask, why do they do it? Not in a cynical way, usually, in a genuine way. Why do young men and women choose to stand in those boxes in all weather and all seasons, while tourists photograph them and children tap their boots and occasionally someone arrives with a novelty mustache? The easy answers exist: tradition, duty, the regiment, the history. But those answers are true in the same way that saying a cathedral is made of stone is true. Accurate, incomplete. The fuller answer, I think, is something like this. There are things that need to be continuous in order to be real. A ceremony that happens when it's convenient isn't a ceremony. A guard that can be distracted isn't a guard. A post that gets abandoned when it gets uncomfortable isn't worth guarding. The value of what those men and women do on that forecourt isn't in the spectacle of it. It's in the constancy. Every day, in all weather, with or without an audience, with or without a tourist trying to stick a fake mustache on them. The thing continues, and in continuing it means something. It means this is worth protecting. It means I am here. It means nothing that happens today will change what I am. I walked home through the park as the late afternoon light made everything golden. The palace behind me, the mall stretching out ahead, the grass still wet, and the sky doing something complicated with pink and gray. I'd gone out for a Tuesday morning meeting and come back with a whole day. It was April Fool's Day, and everyone who'd tried to make the guards look foolish had ended up looking instead at something they hadn't expected to find. Something that made them quiet and thoughtful, and in at least one case, spontaneously start clapping for a man who'd already marched away and couldn't hear them. There's a lesson in there somewhere, I think. Probably several. 3 days after April Fool's Day, I got an email. I'm not going to pretend I was expecting it. I'd posted something brief on a local community forum, one of those neighborhoodish online spaces where people share things that happened in the area, lost cats and traffic updates, and occasionally something that doesn't fit either category. I'd written maybe 3 paragraphs about what I'd seen. The mustache attempt, the child, Margaret, falling, and the guard who came to help her. I didn't expect anyone to respond. By the following Thursday, I had 47 replies. Let me tell you about some of them, because I think they matter. A woman called Susan wrote that she'd been there that morning with her daughter, who was 9 and had autism, and for whom crowds were often overwhelming. She wrote that when Whitfield had given that command, stand clear of the sentry, the sudden sound had frightened her daughter badly. Her daughter had started to cry, and then something had happened that Susan had been trying to find words for ever since. The guard had not moved, had not reacted, had not done anything at all. And her daughter, after a moment of crying, had looked at him and gone quiet. She told me later, Susan wrote, that she stopped being scared because he wasn't. That's how she said it. She stopped being scared because he wasn't. She's 9. She understood something I'm not sure I could have put into words at her age. I read that 3 times. A man called Robert wrote that he'd been there for a different reason. He was a veteran himself, not a ceremonial regiment, a different kind of service, one that had taken him to places he didn't name in the email. He'd come to the palace that day simply to walk, the way he sometimes did when his thoughts needed somewhere to go. He'd seen the whole morning from a different angle than I had further back, near the memorial, where he'd sat on a stone step and watched. What people don't understand, he wrote, is that standing still like that is actually one of the hardest things. Not physically, though that's no joke either. Mentally. Holding yourself completely in the face of whatever comes, whatever people do, whatever the weather does, whatever's happening in your own head. Whitfield and Osai, they're not nothing. They're everything. They're the whole weight of a thing distilled into a person. He paused at that. In the email, you could feel the pause, the way you feel a pause in speech, and then added. I clapped too after Whitfield marched off. I was the first one, I didn't plan it. He was Orange Beanie's companion, as it turned out, not a tourist, a British veteran visiting for reasons of his own, the one who'd shrugged when Tyler asked how the guard could stand there like that. He hadn't shrugged because he didn't know. He'd shrugged because he did. A retired schoolteacher named Helen wrote about Private Oce helping Margaret. She'd seen it from close by, much closer than I had, and she described the moment in detail I didn't have. The way Oce had assessed the situation before he moved, a fraction of a second, but enough to establish that his action would be controlled, the exact phrasing of what he'd said to Margaret, which Helen had heard clearly. Are you all right, ma'am? Take a moment. 4 words and a direction, calm, present. I've been a teacher for 30 years, Helen wrote. I know the difference between training and character. Training teaches you the action. Character teaches you the tone. That young man had both. And then there was Tyler, Orange Beanie himself. His email arrived last, on a Saturday morning, and it was short enough that I can describe it without reproducing it. He said he'd found my post somehow, shared through someone, he wasn't sure how. He said he wanted me to know that the morning had changed something for him, though he was struggling to say what exactly. He said the mustache thing had been stupid, and he knew it, and he wasn't going to make excuses for it other than to say that sometimes you arrive somewhere and you don't quite understand what it is yet, and you behave accordingly. He said he'd read about what Oce had done in the afternoon with Margaret. He said he'd wanted to ask a question, and my post had seemed like the most likely place anyone might know the answer. The question was, how do you get there? How do you get to the place where you can just be what you are completely without needing anyone to see it? I didn't have a good answer for him. I'm not sure there is a good answer, in the sense of one you can write in an email and send to someone and have it work. I wrote back something honest, that I thought it had less to do with what you trained for and more to do with what you decided mattered, and that deciding something really mattered was the beginning of a very long and ongoing process that looked different for everyone but probably involved, at some point, doing the thing even when you didn't feel like it, even when no one was watching, even when it was April Fool's Day, and it would be so much easier to just react. He wrote back one line, yeah, okay, I think I understand that. I want to spend a moment on what it actually means to be a household division sentry, because I think it's easy to watch the ceremony and miss the substance. The household division, the regiments responsible for guarding the sovereign and the royal palaces, has a history that goes back centuries. The specific duties at Buckingham Palace and the other residences are not ceremonial in the way that word sometimes implies a separation from real function. These are operational soldiers. Their training is the same training any soldier receives, plus the specific requirements of public duties, which impose their own particular demands. The sentry duty itself requires complete immobility during certain phases of the position, movement during others, the slow march up and down in front of the box that people recognize, and a capacity to manage the public space around them while maintaining their formal duty. They are authorized to give commands to the public when necessary. They are authorized to use their weapon in extreme circumstances, the same as any on-duty soldier. What they are not authorized to do is react to provocation, to engage with tourists attempting to distract them, to respond to jokes or cameras or people making faces or, yes, fake mustaches. The reason is not that they've been conditioned out of normal human response. The reason is that the post itself is more important than any individual moment within it. You stand the post. The post has been stood by men and women before you. It will be stood by men and women after you. Your individual discomfort, amusement, irritation, or boredom is subordinate to the continuity of what the post represents. That's not inhuman. That's actually a very specific kind of humanity, the kind that understands its own place within something larger and accepts it without resentment. There's one more thing that happened in the days after April Fool's Day that I want to tell you about. A photographer, professional with the kind of cameras that cost more than most people's first cars, had been at the palace that morning, working, not visiting. Shooting some commercial thing for a tourism campaign, which meant he'd been there early, had a proper position, and had his equipment pointed in the right direction for most of the day. He sent me a photograph. Not to use publicly, I'm not going to describe it in detail out of respect for that, but just to show me what he'd caught, entirely by accident, at a moment he hadn't been specifically focusing on. It was the moment Osei returned to his box after helping Margaret. The exact moment he settled back into his position, rifle coming to the shoulder, chin coming up, gaze going forward. The rain was visible in the image individual drops caught by the camera's speed. The gold of the palace behind him, the wet stone of the forecourt below. His face was completely composed. Not blank composed, there is a difference. Blank is the absence of expression. Composed is the presence of something that has decided to be still. The photographer wrote simply, "I've photographed soldiers in 9 countries. I've never captured anything like that. I've thought a lot about what those 2 guards did and didn't do on April Fool's Day. They didn't react to mockery. They didn't perform for the cameras. They didn't make a show of their discipline or congratulate themselves for their composure. They helped when help was needed and stood when standing was required, and neither of those things took anything from the other. What the day tried to do was reveal a gap, tried to find the space between the image and the reality, the performance and the person, the costume and the man inside it. That's what pranks do, really. They look for seams. They try to find where the pretending is happening so they can pull at it and let the truth fall out. But there were no seams. Whitfield and Osei weren't pretending to be soldiers on duty. They were soldiers on duty. The uniform wasn't a costume over a person. The person had grown into the uniform, and the uniform had grown into the person, and the thing they were, on that particular Tuesday in the April drizzle, with their whole careers ahead of them and the weight of centuries of this same duty behind them, was entirely real. You can't prank the real thing. The prank just slides off. Tyler sent one final email about a week after everything. He was back home by then, Chicago, as it turned out. He said he'd been thinking about the trip and trying to articulate what had stayed with him, and he'd settled on something he wanted to share. He said, "I think I came to London expecting to see something historic, like a performance of history, and instead I saw someone doing their job, just completely doing their job, and I didn't know those were different things until I saw the second one." He said he'd stopped making April Fool's Day pranks this year for the first time since he was a kid, not as a resolution or a statement, just because he'd lost the appetite for looking for seams. He signed off, "Tell the guards thanks if you ever see them again. I haven't been able to pass on the message in any official way, and I'm not sure it would translate correctly if I did. But I think, in the way that these things work without needing to be spoken, Corporal Whitfield and Private Os probably don't need to be told. They know what they are. They've always known. That's the whole point." I walked past the palace again this morning. Late start, nothing scheduled, one of those London days where the weather has decided to be generous and everything looks washed and clear and slightly unreal in the early sun. There was a new guard in the box. Young. I don't know his name or his regiment or how many rotations he's done. He was standing exactly as guards have stood in this place for generations, straight, still present. A tourist stopped in front of him. Middle-aged man, camera bag over one shoulder. He looked at the guard for a long moment, the way you look at something you're trying to properly see rather than just photograph. He didn't take a picture. He just looked. And then he nodded, a small, sincere nod, the kind you give when something has your respect, and walked on. The guard stood his post. The sun was on the gold of the gates. London carried on around them both, vast and busy and magnificent, not watching, not needing to watch, because some things don't need an audience to be real. Some things just are,